It's 1783, and America has just won its independence from Britain. It's now free. But now, American colonists face a different problem. They need a government in which to rule. They have to decide, are they going to be 13 separate little countries? Are they going to be one unified country? What sort of a government is actually going to run that country? As Americans are figuring this out, we have to remember that they've come out of a pretty toxic relationship with England at this point. Americans are really quite scared of a central government that is far removed from the people getting too much power. They all sort of agree that having 13 separate little colonies is not going to be the way to go. 13 separate little countries is not going to work, and that they do all need to come together. But again, most of them are extremely apprehensive at the idea of a powerful central government because they've just come out of a place with a powerful central government who did some pretty unfair things to them by their own thoughts. Now, America didn't come out of the war with no idea about what was going to do or what its government was going to look like. During the Revolution, the Continental Congress had actually drafted a government, which America ends up initially adopting. This is known as the Articles of Confederation. It's our first attempt at governing ourselves. The Articles of Confederation essentially set up a confederacy where each of the 13 states will have a large amount of autonomy, but they're basically banding together for mutual protection. So the Articles of Confederation government is a weak central government. Most of the power will reside with individual states. This government will have a president. The president is elected by Congress, will only serve a one-year term. Congress has only one house. It has no power to tax. It has no power to raise an army in the event of a conflict. If the government needs money, it must ask individual states to give it that money. Congress can declare war, but then it must ask individual states to give it an army, which is a bit problematic if a state decides that they don't necessarily want to do that. There is no provision in here to force the states to comply with this. States get that autonomy on their own. And this Confederation government also does not have a judicial branch, as we know it. The judicial branch does not, in fact, exist. This goes into effect, and right away there are some problems. People begin to notice that having this weak central government, having this almost yearly change out of officials is problematic because it means no one's staying in government long enough to actually get anything done. But also the government is kind of weak. And this is going to be quickly shown by an event that occurs in 1786. During that year, America entered a sort of a fiscal crisis. And the fiscal crisis was mostly in the New England area. The South has been dependent on enslaved labor and cash crops. And so when the revolution is over, they go straight back to farming. And the South actually quickly pays off all of its debts from the revolution. The North, though, still retains a lot of debts. Northern economy by the 1780s had been almost entirely built on trade with England. That trade no longer occurs because we are no longer part of the British Empire. And so places, particularly Massachusetts, are struggling to meet their financial obligations. And one of those financial obligations was paying soldiers who'd served in the Continental Army. In fact, many of the soldiers in New England had not been paid in a couple of years. And they were basically given little IOUs by the government saying, we'll pay you when we get the money. So these soldiers all return home to their farms, some of which have been destroyed or haven't been farmed for a while. And they have a problem. They have to get these farms running again, rebuild houses, barns, and they don't have any money because they haven't been paid. Many of them are forced to take out loans. Now, the thing about borrowing money is that sooner or later, people want their money back. If you buy things on your credit card people, they're going to eventually want that money back from you, usually with interest. And so when these creditors come around to these former soldiers, they go, well, we want our money, but they don't have any money. And many of these soldiers realize they would have the money if the government would just pay them. The government doesn't have any money to pay them. So in Massachusetts, this comes to a head when a man named Daniel Shays begins organizing his neighbors into essentially an army with the intentions of marching to Boston and demanding their payment, or at least demanding that the government stop the wave of foreclosures that are coming on these poor farmers. It's not their fault they can't pay their bills. The government never paid them their salaries. When Daniel Shays and his army began marching their way towards Boston, Massachusetts asks the Congress for help. But the Articles of Confederation Congress can't do anything. There's nothing they can do about this uprising. And finally, some rich people in Boston actually hire sort of a mercenary army to go out and beat Daniel Shays and put down this rebellion. This is an alarming thing for people all across the new states because they suddenly just realized that the Articles of Confederation government isn't very useful in a crisis. They can't do what they're supposed to do. This government doesn't function well. And so in 1787, a group of men get together and they decide to ask the Articles of Confederation Congress to hold a convention we now call the Constitutional Convention. But initially, the idea behind this was for delegates to go and talk about the Articles of Confederation and see if there was a way to make them better. So the delegates, the 55 delegates that are actually sent to Philadelphia to be part of this convention, weren't supposed to make a new government. They were supposed to fix the existing government, suggest some tweaks that would make it a more functioning government. Now, when these guys get to Philadelphia and they sit down and they start looking at the situation as it lies, they realize right away that there is really no way to fix the Articles of Confederation. And they quickly come to an agreement that they have to do something radical. They're going to overthrow the government. We don't tend to think about the Constitutional Convention in that light, but that is exactly what happens. These 55 men decide to overthrow the functioning government of the United States by creating a new and better government for it. So to do this, they have to do a few things. The first thing they do is they know they need to be respectable. Our friend George Washington is there at that meeting, so they elect him to be the president of the proceedings. Americans love George Washington. They trust him, and these delegates are like, anything we do, if it has Washington's stamp of approval, the people will be behind it. The next thing they do is they close the proceedings to the public. They don't allow the public to come in and watch them work, which raised a lot of eyebrows at the time because, let's face it, there's no TV in the 18th century. Watching political groups at work was something people did for entertainment. People used to go to courthouses for entertainment. To be fair, fights breaking out in political and judicial events were much more common then, so it was probably a lot more entertaining. But these men quickly say, nope, we're not going to allow the public in here because they don't want anyone to know what they're doing. They don't want any opposition. They'll even go so far as to close and bar the windows, which, I'm going to be honest, in a time when bathing regularly and deodorant did not exist, and it was summer in Philadelphia, Independence Hall was smelling pretty bad by the end of this, like really bad. Like we don't think about that when we're thinking about the Constitution. We're like, oh, it is a glorious thing where all of these glorious men got together and formed a city. That place smelled horribly. It was just a bunch of dudes in there sweating excessively while they argued what a government should look like. Nothing glorious to that. And I know somebody hopes that I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. Smelly and gross. Quickly, one person is going to rise to sort of the head of this. There are actually two people that become leaders within this. One of them has a hit Broadway musical named after him. The one that actually did all the work you've probably never heard of. This is our friend James Madison. Madison's going to work with Alexander Hamilton, but many of the great compromises are actually Madison's idea. Madison is going to quickly suggest a new type of government, a government with three separate branches: an executive branch, a president, a legislative branch, a Congress, and a judicial branch. He argues that having these three separate branches of government would make a powerful government more secure because it would provide checks and balances. So he argues that these three different bodies should have the power to check each other's power so that no one branch of government becomes so powerful that it could be a threat to people's liberties. And quickly, everyone in the Congress agrees with this. This seems like a good idea, and it's in line with the thoughts of the Enlightenment at the time. When it comes to the executive, they're actually not sure what to call him initially. George Washington will hammer that out later. But they decide right away this executive should serve longer than a year. It takes longer than a year to stabilize a government. So the executive, underneath this new proposed constitution, will serve a 4-year term. There are no limits at this time as to how many terms a president can run for. Most presidents limit themselves to 2 because George Washington limited himself to 2. We don't actually have a constitutional amendment saying that a president can only run for 2 terms until after FDR successfully wins 4 terms in office. Now, then becomes the question of how do we put this person in power? And right away, we decide letting Congress pick this person is no good because that's not going to provide a good check on the power of Congress. It's going to give Congress too much power. The delegates are also aware that common people need to feel like they have a voice in government. And so right away, they say, we'll hold popular elections. We'll let people vote for this executive, this president. But we don't want people to have too much power. People aren't really smart, and they might get led astray by some person who's actually terribly unsuitable to be president, but talks a good game. So we need to put a buffer in there to be sure that people feel like they're electing the president, but they're not really electing the president. And so they create a system we call today, and was called at the time, the Electoral College, which is a group of delegates sent by each state to actually elect the president. This is an institution that Americans fail to understand, always forget about, but it's actually there as a safeguard to prevent some lunatic from getting in office. And we've basically neutered the Electoral College at this point by passing laws in most states saying electors have to vote the way their state votes. But when this was first put in place, those rules didn't exist. Technically, the Electoral College could have picked out someone who didn't even run for president. But the Electoral College, if you're ever asking why it exists, it solely exists because your founding fathers thought you were too stupid to be trusted to elect the president, honestly. That's the only reason the Electoral College exists. So we've hammered out the executive, and we give him some rights and some duties. You're not required to know all the specifications of this for the AP exam. But if you're planning to take AP Gov next year, you will have to know all of that stuff. So maybe start familiarizing yourself now. The next branch we really flesh out is the judicial branch. And we don't write a lot about that. We basically say this Supreme Court's going to hang out and it's going to settle disputes between the states and the federal government. That's really all we have to say, other than who can serve on this court and things of that nature. Those things we hammer out later. And again, you're not required to know those details for the AP exam. Then we have a problem. We have a problem when it comes to what does this legislative branch look like? What does our Congress look like? And so we have our first big argument in the Constitutional Convention, an argument that actually grinds debate and work on this Constitution to a complete stop. And that debate is over what the legislative branch will actually look like. Now, there are multiple plans put in place, but 2 of them really rise to the top. The Virginia plan, also sometimes known as the Big State Plan, the New Jersey Plan, sometimes known as the Small State Plan. The Virginia plan proposed a legislature that was bicameral, meaning it had 2 houses, an upper and lower house. But the Virginia plan argued that representation should be determined by a state's population. Bigger states should have more representatives because more people live there. They are bigger states for a reason. Now, if you're a big state, this actually seems like a really good plan. You should be able to get laws passed that benefit your people. But if you're a small state, this looks really terrible, because what if something that the big states want is going to be really terrible for your small state? You won't have the power to overrule that in this Congress. So New Jersey puts forward a plan that favors small states. New Jersey calls for a unicameral legislature. That means it only has 1 house, and that everyone should have equal representation. Each state should have the same number of representatives. That way, small states won't be overrun by big states. Now, you can see this plan doesn't appeal much to big states, because now they might not be able to pass the legislation they need because they might not be, it would be difficult for them to get a majority over the small states. Congress actually grinds to a halt over this until our friend James Madison offers what becomes known as the Great Compromise, in which he basically borrows from both of these plans to create our modern day Congress. So he looks at this plan and he says, look, there are pros and cons to both sides of this. I like the Virginia plan's idea of a bicameral legislature, a legislature that has two houses, an upper and a lower house. A lower house that will perhaps originate legislation, but a more powerful upper house that could check that legislation and be sure that it's appropriate. So he proposes a lower house, which we call the House of Representatives, that will be based on population. That population will be determined by a census every 10 years, and every 10 years will redistribute based on whose populations have changed. So in the lower house, bigger states will have more representatives. But in the more powerful upper house, the Senate, each state will have the same number of representatives. It's a balance, and one which everyone agrees to at this point. But then the next argument arises with, okay, but we're going to do this census, right? And we're going to count people for the purposes of representation. But who counts in that population? Do we just count men, white men who can vote? Do we just count white men? Do women and children count? And what about all of those slaves living in America, particularly in the American South? Northerners who have fewer slaves argue that since slaves are legally property, like unfortunately livestock or anything else that's property, they shouldn't count for the purposes of representation, but they should count for the purposes of taxation because they're property. In the South, this is problematic because most Southern states have a much higher population of Black enslaved people than they do of white people, which means that they will have very little representation in this new Congress. So Southerners argue, well, women and children can't vote either, but we're counting them, so we should count slaves as well. They should count. The laws being passed by this Congress will affect them. So they should count, but they shouldn't count as much for property taxes because, after all, they are people. An ironic thing to come rolling out of the South in the 1700s. Once again, we're met with a really, really terrible compromise. This is the horribly named Three-Fifths Compromise, in which our founding fathers decide that African Americans can count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and for the purposes of taxation. So each African American person will count as 3/5 of a white person. Again, one of the more horrible things to come out of the old Constitutional Convention is the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, once our founding fathers have drafted this glorious document, they now have to spring this on the American government. They've basically done a thing that they weren't supposed to do, and now they have to convince America that they're right. And so they make this document public. They come out and they say, look, we tried to fix the Articles of Confederation. They were broken beyond repair, but we've created this new and better government. And we think that this is the best government. We have a ratification process for this. As soon as the majority of the 13 states ratify this Constitution, it will become the law of the land, and we will all abide by it and agree to it. Quickly, we have the development of really some of the very, very first political parties in America. We have two groups develop in response to this Constitution, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. These are important groups to remember because it would not be outside the realm of possibilities for you to see a short answer question asking you to compare these two groups or how they feel relative to the Constitution. So remember, the Federalists support the Constitution. They believe that a strong central government is the best way to protect personal or individual liberties. The Anti-Federalists do not support this new Constitution. Now, they have a variety of reasons why this. Most of them are afraid of the powerful federal government that's being set up in this new Constitution. And they believe that state governments are better positioned to protect individual rights and liberties. Some don't necessarily, though, hate this Constitution. What they dislike is the fact that the Constitution at this time does not have a Bill of Rights. So the Constitution, as presented to the American people, has no Bill of Rights. And so many anti federalists point to this and they say, okay, it's a good idea as far as it goes, but where are the protections for individual freedoms? Where are the list of things that this government cannot take away from people? Now, some of our friends from the Constitutional Convention go on the offensive. They begin writing a series of extremely boring essays known as the Federalist Papers. If you're taking AP Gov next year, you're going to read a variety of them. They are boring as dirt. It is unfortunate. I mean, there's always like 4 or 5 people out there who are like, I love the Federalist Papers. They're glorious. Look, I spent like years reading 18th century legalese, and I got to tell you, these things are boring. They're really dry. But these letters aim at convincing Americans that this new government is the proper government for America. And they target various arguments against the government. Now, one of the things that they can't target is that desire for a Bill of Rights. And so, what eventually happens is James Madison says, approve the Constitution as it is, and we have a process for amending it. I will amend this Constitution to add a Bill of Rights. And that eventually sways many of the anti federalists who are just upset about that Bill of Rights. So the Constitution is finally approved. And in 1789, we elect George Washington as the country's first president. One of the first things we do is set about amending that Constitution to include a Bill of Rights. Those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which outline the basic liberties that every American has and that their government cannot take away from them. So we've now set up a government. We finished the big moments of period 3, which covers the revolution and sort of the setting up of the government. In our next series of videos, we'll start looking at sort of what America looks like in the 19th century, the divide between the industrial North and slavery in the Old South, and we'll begin sort of setting up the American Civil War.